Hey everyone, my name's Stephen Aguilar. I won't introduce myself because that was already done. So I'll start by first sort of just saying I wrote a book. So a lot of the ideas that I am going to get into today, you can find here. This QR code will be at the end as well, so feel free to just wait if you want to scan it later. A bunch of other stuff I'm working on is there as well. But here's the plan for today. First, I'd like to frame my discussion in thinking about, when we're thinking about AI tools, to really think about what I term and what other learning scientists have termed the socio-technical system, and why that's important when we're thinking about examining the impact of AI tools on learning and teaching, and really everywhere that they happen to appear. Then I'll get into two studies that my PhD students and I have conducted that are fairly recent. The work is currently under review. But the first looks at AI in college. We surveyed over 1,000 college students from across the United States to basically get a better understanding of why they might ask AI for help, or AI chatbots. I'll use AI, but really I'm talking about generative AI here. I just didn't want to type Gen AI all the time. Second, I will look at how teachers have used AI worldwide. So different study, but we're looking at we've looked at how teachers in the United States, India, Qatar, Colombia, and the Philippines have used AI. So first, let's get into the socio-technical system. So the best way I've come up with to describe what I mean by this is by using an example. And if you're from Los Angeles, or really if you drive at all, this is going to be familiar to you. So when I think about the socio-technical system, there's the core technology that operates, right? In this analogy, it's the car. There's the context where it operates, which is the road. And then there's the person, the driver. When these things work well, there's harmony, right? So if you know how to drive, if your car is a halfway decent car and you're driving on pretty good roads, that entire experience is fairly seamless and mostly positive. However, if you're not driving a good car, if you're driving in a potholed road, I got my PhD from the University of Michigan, so after winter, it just wasn't a fun experience. Or if you're just a new driver, so if those of you with children who are like 16 learning how to drive, it doesn't matter what the road is or what the car is, it's not going to be fun for you if you're in the passenger seat. So this socio-technical system really defines what it means for any technology to work well. So I'm using cars here, but really think about any generative AI tool that has been discussed, will be discussed. Think about your laptop. Think about how when something goes wrong, you can generally attribute it to one of these three dimensions. Either the core technology is not working properly, the environment through which it operates is somehow not working well, or the people using the technology isn't working well. Another concrete example of this is, back about 15 years ago, one-to-one device programs were very popular everywhere, really. So LA Unified invested heavily in one-to-one iPads, thinking that giving kids iPads would be sufficient to promote learning, without understanding that teachers, kids needed to be trained on how to use them, but also that the infrastructure just wasn't there. So when we're thinking about generative AI and how it might be misused by students, we can really also think about these environmental factors, these structural factors that might end up impacting the experience, and whether or not it ends up being adaptive or maladaptive. So, there's a picture I made here. This is it in harmony. So you want things to work well together. So let's get into the details of why college students seek help from AI. So I want to sort of make a distinction here. It isn't the case that every single college student or every single student, their use of AI isn't primarily adaptive or maladaptive. They have lots of different reasons for why they're using different Gen AI tools. It isn't the case that they're all offloading their intelligence onto ChatGPT or whichever tool of choice. My students and I asked two research questions. We were interested in what factors predicted instrumental generative AI use. So instrumental, think of it using AI as a tool, as an instrument. You usually wouldn't cede your intelligence or your cognition or your agency over to an instrument. You use the tool doesn't use you, is basically the way to think about that research question. The second is what predicts generative AI help seeking that's executive. This is sort of the concern that everyone is talking about. Basically, AI is doing the thinking. I'm not sort of engaging in productive struggle. So our sample was fairly large. We surveyed over 1,000 college students from across the United States, about a 50-50 split, but skewed a little bit to female. They were, from all across the undergraduate experience, though it did also skew older. So 14% were first-year students, 21% second year, 27% third, about a third were fourth years, and a few were fifth years and after. So we were looking at sort of what we can kind of consider traditional college students. And the sample was fairly diverse, over half white, and then a fairly diverse sample after that. Here were the things that we were interested in asking them when we were curious about, why are they using generative AI? First was academic help seeking. So academic help seeking is basically the formalized process that a student would go to seek help. Why do they seek help outside of, their textbook? Why do they go to a professor? Why do they go to a peer or a TA? There are different reasons why a student would do that. The sources that we were interested in were instructor sources, peer sources, tutors, the internet, basically anything that's not generative AI or generative AI. We had a few subscales, instrumental and executive, threat or avoidance. I'm not going to get into those last two. Why did they use generative AI? So basically, why did they, how confident did they feel when, just academically? So every student is on the spectrum in terms of how much academic self-efficacy they have, how prepared they feel to engage in coursework. And finally, the self-efficacy scale. And we had a number of controls, whether or not they have preferences, their frequency, their general trust in AI, whether or not they worry about AI over-reliance. Our analytic approach was we just used standard regression to predict our outcomes. Our outcomes were instrumental. Basically, I'm ceding over my thinking to AI, or I'm using AI like a tool, or executive, which is I want AI to think for me. The key predictors that we analyzed were habits, attitudes, context, and we looked for some interaction effects. Basically, we want to know how much trust in AI interacted with competence, their own perceived competence, and professor encouragement. I underlined the latter because it ends up being important, and it gets to how I started this conversation, which is context matters, as does environment. So our results, this is sort of the more technical sort of slide. I'll have a so what slide after this. But effectively, both regressions we accounted for a lot of the variance. We explained a lot of why students sort of would seek help instrumentally or executively. Effectively, students with high internet self-efficacy were less likely to use Gen AI instrumentally, and that ends up being important, and I'll define that in the next slide. Students with high trust in AI and perceived confidence engaged in the most instrumental help seeking. So I'll just go to that slide now, actually. So basically, what's the so what? Why should you care, or what are the big takeaway points from this study? First is habit transfer. When students are using AI to learn, and I think most folks in this room, though I'm not quite sure because I haven't spoken to any of you, would sort of probably agree that because that AI could be used in an adaptive way for students to learn more. If students are already kind of good at using traditional research methods, traditional in this case being like they can do their own research on Google, they also use AI to learn, right? There's one instrument, I can use another instrument over here. Social safety. AI, sometimes students, especially now anecdotally, but there's also been some studies to suggest that help seeking is becoming a little bit more socially risky. You do not want to look incompetent, so you might not want to ask a peer or professor or a tutor. Why students do this, why they do it, is a function of their own sort of internal self-efficacy. So students who are afraid to ask their classmates for help would turn to AI instead. Teacher influence. So here's sort of, I think, at least one point I want folks to walk away from, is that when professors encouraged AI use, when they set policies, when it was something that was an open topic of discussion in coursework, students used AI more productively. And this is a fairly intuitive point, but it's one worth underscoring, which is faculty and basically any leader in a learning environment defines what does and doesn't count as cheating, how you can use tools as instruments. Our first speaker sort of outlined a way that could happen in terms of documenting use. So when you do that, you encourage adaptive use of AI, or instrumental use, which is the more adaptive use. The most productive users were those who used it as a tool and felt confident. Again, this is a fairly intuitive point, but if I think I can use the tool well, then I will likely use it well. Like I could probably be trained how to use it. I don't feel like I'm cheating, and et cetera. Now, what about the behaviors that we're all actually concerned about, which is when were they more likely to outsource their own thinking and use AI executively? Trust, right? If students think that AI is accurate, they're going to use it, right? If they're not questioning, interrogating, it doesn't have to be at the level of hallucination. It could just be at a level of sophistication. The AI could be mostly right, but not nuanced enough, right? When students aren't asking those questions, they're more likely to just use it to give them the answer. Low confidence. So if students weren't actually felt that they were sort of good at their core subject, they would likely outsource that work, right? So this again gets to the competence point. So again, the safety net here, again, underlining the role of professors, is encouragement from professors actually lowered dependency-focused use, right? If you set the guidelines, then they will likely not use it executively. So those were our core findings in this study. Happy to get into the details during Q&A. Now let's sort of shift our focus and think about AI use among teachers worldwide. Often here in the States, we sort of have this myopic focus in terms of what we're doing. AI is a global phenomenon, and lots of different teachers in lots of different countries are wrestling with it in different ways. So we were interested in understanding those ways. We wanted to understand what predicted the positive beliefs about Gen AI's impact on teaching and learning. Why do they want to use it? Which factors explain concerns, especially around plagiarism and student creativity? Again, those are the sort of the concerns that tended to rise to the surface. AI will be used to plagiarize, or AI will be used to undermine creativity. And we were also interested in whether or not any of those differences differed by country. We assumed that there would be some differences, but it's always good to pose the question. Our sample was, again, fairly large, 1,500 teachers across 5 countries, 500 from the US, 300 from India, a little under 300 from Qatar, about 200 from Colombia, and about 100 from the Philippines. This research, I should mention, was done in partnership with the WISE Foundation out of Qatar. So they facilitated a lot of these relationships, and we also have some qualitative work where we spoke with teachers, but they were an instrumental partner in doing this work. So when we're thinking about who these teachers are, this slide effectively shows, their education level. We can see that they're fairly comparable. There are some differences. For example, Indian teachers have sort of had more professional training, but for the most part, the education level was comparable across countries. Pathways were similarly comparable. Most teachers in our sample went through traditional university-based teaching pathways, though again there were some subtle differences, but not enough to sort of elevate this to like a core finding. The key takeaway here is that teachers across countries were mostly the same in terms of training and in terms of education. What we were interested in measuring was AI readiness. So this was a composite measure of awareness of AI, confidence in using AI, and their perceived usefulness of AI. Do I think it's useful in my teaching practice? We measured their beliefs about the positive impact of AI. So beliefs whether or not AI actually helps improve learning. Does it help my teaching? Does it help sort of my own conception of educational equity? Contextual factors that we looked at were institutional support. Does my home institution support or give me any sort of guidance around AI? And this will be an important point that sort of mirrors our last finding, but policies matter. Contextual factors were also whether or not teachers had English proficiency. And we used this mostly because we sort of understood that there weren't a lot of other language-specific Gen AI tools, especially in countries like the Philippines, for example, who teach a lot in English. So they were still using English-based LLMs or English-based tools. And we also measured concerns. Again, concerns of plagiarism and creativity, whether or not they felt that use of Gen AI would undermine their creativity. So our analytic approach was similar. We specified 3 regression models where we measured the positive impact of AI beliefs. This was a fairly decent R-squared. We accounted for about half of the variance. The other 2, not as good. Although in education research, it's not terrible, where we accounted for about 7% or 6% of the variance. Basically, the difference within teachers in terms of plagiarism and creativity. Our controls were country, because we were interested in country level differences, age, gender, teaching experience, and education level. So when we're thinking about our results, basically thinking about our predictors of optimism, AI readiness was the strongest predictor of positive beliefs, followed by institutional support. So if teachers were already either doing their own independent research or sort of had this notion that they could use AI to support their instructional practices, that predicted optimism, as did institutional support, right? This mirrors the college student finding, where if the institution set guidelines or gave trainings or otherwise enabled them to have a more understanding of how they could potentially use AI, they were more likely to be positive, to have positive opinions about its use. We call this the creativity paradox. So teachers who had higher AI readiness and higher use were more concerned. And this sort of can get you sort of to this idea that one way to think about this is that they just weren't naive. They understood that AI could do a lot of things that could undermine learning, right? The more understanding they had, the more they might understand how it could be misused. And we can understand this in general tool use. If I know how to use something really well, then I probably also know how to misuse it a lot. We're looking at country level differences. Teachers in India reported significantly higher positive beliefs. Teachers in Qatar reported significantly higher plagiarism concerns. So when we're thinking about so what, here are sort of 3 ideas to walk away with. Support fuels buy-in. This is a fairly intuitive point. But if they feel trained and backed by their school administration, they will have positive beliefs about using AI. This is different than buying a tool and saying you must use this now. Providing a tool or providing access is not the same as providing support. Again, there are informed skeptics. So teachers who use AI the most are the most worried because, again, they understand the potential drawbacks to instruction. They've likely tried it, have failed. We have a lot of qualitative work and interviews where we spoke with a number of these teachers, where it was sort of the case that they were more likely to have experimented, which means they were more likely to have failed at using AI in some sort of instructional capacity. Context matters. So anxiety about cheating and plagiarism isn't necessarily driven by the technology itself. A lot of this it was sort of a function of the school's or the country's academic culture. So I didn't get into this too much, but one thing that should be acknowledged is that the educational landscape across these countries is very different. It's very centralized. In Qatar, for example, top-down Ministry of Education basically defines exactly what's taught by whom and where. They have sort of a parallel system that's a little different, but it's still, relative to the US, much more rigid in terms of how it functions. In the US, it depends. It depends on which district you're in, which school you're in, what school leader you have. There's a lot more variance and variability when it comes to AI policies. And then the Philippines and India were sort of mixed. So that, I went a little fast, but that sort of covers both studies. There's more information if you scan the QR code where you can get book information, my newsletter. I start a podcast if you like listening to my voice. Otherwise, you can reach out if you have any questions about this research or other research I've done.
Thank you very much.